The Swedish police spent 40 years chasing the wrong man for one of Europe's most famous murders. I've read the case files myself. They're thick enough to stop a bullet. In February 1986, Olof Palme, Prime Minister of Sweden, architect of Nordic socialism, a man who'd stood up to superpowers, was shot dead on a Stockholm street at 11:21 p.m. The official line for decades was simple. A career criminal named Christer Pettersson pulled the trigger. Case closed. Conviction secured, except it wasn't. The accepted narrative held for years. Pettersson, a drifter with a heroin habit, no clear motive, and a face that matched some eyewitness accounts, was arrested, tried, convicted in 1989. The Swedish public exhaled. Their prime minister's killer was behind bars. But here's what bothers me about tidy endings. They are rarely tidy when you look at the seams. The murder itself was surgical. Palme and his wife Lisbeth were walking home from a cinema. No bodyguards, no security detail. 2 shots fired. One grazed his wife's arm. One went through Palme's back and exited his chest. He was 59 years old. The shooter vanished into the Stockholm night. No weapon recovered at the scene. No clear motive attached to Pettersson. No witnesses who could place him there with certainty. The Swedish Supreme Court overturned Pettersson's conviction in 1989, just months after he was sentenced. The evidence, they ruled, was insufficient. He was released. And suddenly, the case that was supposed to be closed became an open wound that never healed. 40 years later, it still hasn't. That's the hinge point where everything changes. So who actually pulled the trigger? The conventional wisdom says we don't know. But if you trace the threads, the geopolitics, the enemies Palme had made, the timing, a different picture emerges. Palme wasn't just a Swedish politician. He was a thorn in the side of every major power that mattered during the Cold War's dying gasps. He'd criticized American foreign policy in Central America. He'd met with Vietnamese leaders. He'd spoken against apartheid in South Africa, loudly, publicly, without the diplomatic cushion other leaders used. For the CIA, for South African intelligence, for the Swedish far-right, Palme wasn't just a problem. He was a symbol, and symbols in the Cold War sometimes got eliminated. Here's what the investigation missed, or rather, what it chose not to pursue. In the months before the assassination, Swedish security services had identified a South African intelligence operation inside Sweden. Not rumors, not speculation, documented. The goal was to monitor anti-apartheid activists and Swedish politicians sympathetic to African liberation movements. Palme was at the top of that list. I've spoken to former intelligence analysts who worked the case. They tell me the same thing. The police investigation was narrow. It focused on Swedish criminals, on local motives, on the kind of murder you solve by checking fingerprints and interviewing witnesses. But this wasn't that kind of murder. This was geopolitics wearing a street-level disguise. The real explanation sits in the space between what was investigated and what was ignored. Swedish far-right extremists with ties to military intelligence. A hired shooter, possibly not Pettersson, possibly someone with professional training. A political establishment that had reasons to let certain stones remain unturned. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's institutional inertia dressed up as due process. In 2020, Swedish police reopened the case and arrested a new suspect, a man with documented ties to right-wing extremist circles. The case is still pending, but here's what matters. They're finally looking in the right direction. Not at random criminals. At people with motive, with means, with access to networks that could execute a political killing and vanish. The implications are larger than one murder. When a sitting prime minister can be killed on a city street, and the investigation takes 4 decades to point at the actual perpetrators, you're not looking at a failure of police work. You're looking at a failure of will. Governments, Swedish, American, South African, had reasons to keep this case murky. Palme was dead. Keeping the truth buried was cheaper than letting it out. Cold War history isn't just about missiles and spy satellites. It's about the people who got in the way. Palme got in the way. And when you get in the way of that machinery, sometimes the machinery reaches out and removes the obstacle. The Swedish investigation is finally, starting to acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning. The case isn't solved yet, but we're closer to the real story now than we've ever been. And that story isn't about a random criminal on a Stockholm street. It's about power, about silencing dissent, about what governments will do to protect themselves when a leader becomes too inconvenient to keep alive. Subscribe for the next Unsolved Assassination. Every week we dig into the cases the powerful wanted buried.